The seizure alarm had been running for 11 minutes before the human climbed through the hull breach it had no business climbing through. Vial heard it before she saw it. A change in the electromagnetic field threading through the freighter's bulkheads. A new signature. Small and fast and producing the particular harmonic that Sethka senses registered as biological warmth. Warm-blooded. Bipedal. Moving toward the cargo hold with no apparent concern for the fact that the ship was technically still listed as an active Zovari seizure site, and the cartel's enforcement protocols were quite explicit about non-personnel boarding during active recovery proceedings. She shifted in her restraint harness. The harness was rated for 2 standard tons. She was rated at 3.4. The cartel had noted this in her manifest as a defect. The human dropped through the access hatch with the confident, ugly grace of something that had done exactly this before. It wore salvage gear. Patched at the left shoulder, burnt along the right forearm, a medic's satchel hanging from one hip that had clearly been repaired more times than its original materials could honestly account for. Its face was brown and weathered, and completely, entirely without fear. It looked at Vial. Vial's scales went deep crimson. She was 3.7 meters from foot to crown, built wide across the shoulders in the way that Sethka built wide when their gravity well ran above standard 0.8. Her colony's deep current territory had been a 0.9 environment, and it had made her bones dense and her muscle groups extensive, and her appetite for calories that the colony's allocation systems had not been structured to accommodate. She was, by Sethka standards, catastrophically oversized. By Zovari standards, she was unsellable breeding stock recently reclassified as processed protein yield. Too large to cycle through standard reproductive management protocols, assessed at a cost-to-return ratio that the intake officer had described, not unkindly, as unfavorable for continued investment. By the manifest clipped to her harness, she was Lot 7-4, Grade 2 organic. The estimated market weight 1,100 kilograms. The human read the manifest. Its face did something Vial could not categorize. It set down the medic's satchel. "Right," it said. Then it started examining her injuries. The lacerations on her left flank had come from the harness itself. The 2-ton structural rating had nothing to say about the comfort of the organism being restrained. And Vial had been in it for the 16-day transport from the colony processing station to the Zovari distribution hub, to this particular way station where the seizure proceedings had begun. The injuries were not fresh. They were also not by Zovari handling standards, notable enough to address prior to processing. The human was addressing them, and it worked with a small light attached to one shoulder of its salvage rig and a steady focus that Vial had no frame of reference for. Not quickly, exactly, but not with the particular economy of something that considers its time more valuable than its subject. It was working with the focus of something that had decided this mattered and was not going to revisit that decision. It found the worst of the lacerations. A deep one along the upper left flank, where the harness bracket had worked into the scale ridge over 16 days, and cleaned it with a solution that stung sharply and then went numb, and sutured it with the focused attention of something operating under a personal conviction that the laceration should not be there. Not urgency, not efficiency. A quiet, besettled certainty that this was wrong and was going to be made less wrong starting now. Vial watched it work. Her scales had shifted from deep crimson to pale silver. The unsettled, scanning silver of a Sethka that had encountered a stimulus for which its existing classification system was inadequate. She had frames of reference for processors. For Zovari handlers and intake officers and the assessors who came through cargo holds with density scanners and data clips and measured everything with the impersonal precision of beings who had learned to see organic material as a unit of account. She had frames of reference for other cargo. The brief, careful non-relationships of shared holding spaces, organisms who had all been given numbers. She did not have a frame of reference for this. "You are not cartel?" she said. She had not intended to speak. Her vocal apparatus had been largely unused for the last several months. There was no one in a cargo hold to sustain a conversation with. And the Zovari staff did not generally engage in exchanges that were not operationally necessary. The words came out rougher than she remembered, slightly wrong at the edges, like machinery that had been in storage. The human did not startle. It glanced up at her, registered that she had spoken, and returned to the suture. "No," it said. "You boarded an active seizure site." "Yep. The cartel's enforcement protocols for active seizure sites." "Yeah." The human tied off the suture and moved to assess the next laceration. Its hands were extremely small for something that had just sutured a wound the width of its own forearm. "I know what the protocols say." It moved to the next injury, as though the protocols were a logistical problem it had already processed and filed somewhere it didn't need to look at again. Vielle watched it for a long time without speaking. The Zovari cargo hold was a standard dimension unit, 12 meters by 8, with a structural grid running across the ceiling that was designed to accommodate multiple restraint configurations. She had been the only occupant since the Polarian transfer station, which was 42 days ago. The overhead lighting ran on a maintenance cycle that dimmed to 60% during off hours. It was currently at 60%. The human had attached its own light to its shoulder, which threw a small, precise beam across the examination field. And in the contrast between the dim overhead and the sharp salvage light, Vielle could see the damage more clearly than she usually allowed herself to look at it. The lacerations were significant. She knew this. She had known it for 42 days and had filed it in the category of facts that were true and non-addressable and therefore not useful to dwell on. The harness was the harness. The harness was rated for what it was rated for. She was what she was rated at. These were the relevant numbers. The human was treating the numbers as if they were wrong. "How did you get past the docking seal?" Vielle asked. The human didn't look up. "Bypass. The docking seals on active seizure sites are modified after the original Accord 7 framework, yeah. Like they updated the protocol in cycle 14 of the current cartel administrative period." The human moved to a laceration near her hip ridge, where the bracket had done the most sustained damage. "The modification has a calibration gap in the secondary authentication sequence. About a 4-second window. I got in on the second try." Vielle processed this. "You researched the calibration gap," she said. "I do a lot of salvage work in Zovari territory." "That is not an answer to what I said." The human paused for just a moment. Then it returned to the examination. "No," it said. "It's not." Vielle's scales were still silver. The silver had deepened, if anything, the particular deep silver of a Sethka that had identified the stimulus as genuinely novel and was committing more processing capacity to the classification effort. Her species had a word for this state. Veskai. The active, curious attention of something that has encountered a situation its prior knowledge cannot resolve. She had not experienced Veskai in 4 cycles. She experienced it now and did not know what to do with it. Vielle watched its electromagnetic field. This was the thing about Sethka perception that other species rarely understood. They did not simply see the world through photoreceptors and auditory membranes. They felt it. Every living thing produced electromagnetic emissions, and fear ran those emissions into a jagged, high-frequency pattern, the kind her ancestors had evolved to detect in the dark electromagnetic murk of Sethka's deep ocean floor, where predators had no faces, but every predator had a current. The human's field was tidal, long and low and unhurried. Not because it was inattentive. It was paying very precise attention to what it was doing. But its nervous system was not running the high-frequency threat response that Vielle would have expected from a small organism alone in a cargo hold with something 3 times its mass. It was calm because it had decided to be here. Vielle had no frame of reference for that. "Why?" she said. The human looked up again. Dark eyes, the kind that had seen too much and appeared to have decided this was not a sufficient reason to stop looking. "Finish the job first," it said. "Talk after." It went back to work. Vielle's scales were still silver. Something at the outer edges of her frills, the chemoreceptive frills she normally kept flat against her collarbone in the posture she had worn for 4 cycles. The posture that said, "I am not a threat. I am not resistant. I am compliant with my classification," had gone very faintly gold. Gold was a color Sethka produced rarely enough that most other species who had observed it had only seen it once. It meant something her language did not have a precise word for. The closest Sethka phrasing translated imperfectly as the electromagnetic signature of a thing that has found its current, reserved for homecoming, for the deep return to the electromagnetic signature of one's birth territory. She had never produced it before. She noted it as a data point requiring further classification, and then she stopped looking at her own frills and watched the human work. The human's name was Ferreira. She offered this on the 3rd day, in the same tone she offered everything: flat, direct, economical, with the implied reservation of further disclosure pending relevance. Vielle had been cataloging her with available tools: electromagnetic field readings, behavioral pattern observation, and the careful study of small details that her species defaulted to when processing something too significant to look at directly. The field was consistent, tidal. The behavioral patterns were less consistent in ways that kept slipping past her existing taxonomic framework. On the 2nd day, Ferreira had eaten something from a foil packet. The smell reached Vielle across 6 meters of cargo hold, and both her chemoreceptive frills deployed simultaneously, full extension, producing the involuntary response her species reserved for compounds that registered as biologically aggressive. Her counter-response chemistry began synthesizing. She recognized the preparation and stopped it before it completed, because this seemed disproportionate given that she was the only organism in the hold experiencing the response, and the human was eating the substance with visible contentment. "That substance," Vielle said, once she had her frills back under control. Ferreira looked at the empty packet. "Capsaicin?" It triggered an acute threat response in my chemoreceptors. "Sorry, I can eat it farther away. I am not requesting that you stop." Vielle paused. "I am asking whether you are aware that it is a neurotoxic compound." Ferreira considered the packet. "Sure," she said. "You consume it recreationally. Makes food taste better." Vielle sat with this for a long time, long enough that Ferreira had finished eating and started a diagnostic cycle on the freighter's drive manifold before Vielle produced her next sentence. "I received a standard species orientation from the Zovari intake system," she said. "Humans were listed as Class 12 Death World origin." Ferreira glanced up. "Yeah." "The classification registered as a number. I did not—" She paused. "What does Class 12 mean, in practical terms?" Ferreira sat back from the diagnostic panel. "Most habitable worlds that develop complex life run Class 3 to 6, she said. Stable geology, manageable predator ecology, something like seasonal predictability. Class 12 means the planet is actively attempting to kill its inhabitants at most times. Active tectonics, atmospheric oxygen levels that support significant combustion events. On a predator density high enough that our evolutionary line went persistence, predator. We chase prey until it collapses from exhaustion because we're the only species on our planet that can keep running long enough to make that work. Vielle processed this. Humans are pursuit predators, she said. By origin, yeah. Most of us have stopped actively doing it. The impulse is still there. Ferreira turned back to the diagnostic. It surfaces when we get invested in something. Vielle filed this. Your bones, she said. Ferreira had run a density scanner across Vielle's injuries during the first examination, and had also briefly scanned herself to calibrate the instrument, and Vielle had been close enough to see the readout. You have healed fractures at 5 sites. The repair point density exceeds surrounding material by a measurable margin. Bones heal stronger at the break. The way she said it, not as a boast, not as an explanation, as an item of basic physical fact, in the same category as this material has this tensile rating. Vielle looked at the hull seam above the access hatch. She counted the weld points. 12. The third from the left was slightly imprecise. She counted them again. On Sethka's ocean floor, she said slowly, there are organisms in the deep electromagnetic zone that are near the apex of the predation hierarchy. They can detect prey through 40 meters of murk by electromagnetic signature alone. She paused. My species evolved alongside them. Ferreira was quiet for a moment. What's your EM detection range? She said. At current acuity, approximately 12 meters active. Passive ambient reading to 20 in quiet conditions. So, you've been reading my field the whole time? Yes. Ferreira nodded once, made a note, kept working. And, she said, your field, Vielle said, does not produce threat signatures at any point, in any situation I have observed. She paused. This is unusual. Okay. It is not a neutral observation. I am... She stopped. She was not accustomed to making statements about her own internal states. The Sovari intake process had not required them, and her cargo hold time before that had not produced occasions that seemed to warrant them. And before that, there had been assessment day, and before assessment day, there had been a colony where she had learned, carefully and early, to be quiet about what she was experiencing. I find it difficult to classify. Ferreira looked up from the diagnostic. Her expression was not any of the ones Vielle had catalogued so far. Quieter, not moving toward her or away from her, simply present in the way the tidal field was present. Yeah, Ferreira said. I know. She went back to the diagnostic. Vielle watched her work. The diagnostic was a drive system analysis. She was building a map of the freighter's power routing, identifying where the governor connected to the main output regulators. She had a stylus in her right hand and was making annotations in a shorthand Vielle could not read. Occasionally, she made a small sound of confirmation or mild displeasure. The difference between them very slight and very specific to the particular information she had just received. Vielle had been filing behavioral observations for 3 days. The file was large. Your species, she said. When injured, you produce a chemical compound in the bloodstream. Ferreira glanced up. Endorphins, she said, and adrenaline. They are analgesic. Among other things. Adrenaline also suppresses non-emergency physiological processes, shunts resources to immediate threat response. You have access to a significant analgesic response during injury. Yeah. This is a death world adaptation. Pretty much everything about us is. Vielle processed this. You are aware of that. Ferreira set the stylus down. She had the expression that Vielle had learned to recognize as the one that appeared when the human had decided more information was warranted. Not reluctance. Calibration. Said there's a word in our history for it, Ferreira said. Memento mori. It means, remember you will die. Humans used to say it to each other as a philosophical reminder. She picked up the stylus again. The idea being that knowing you're mortal shapes how you live, what you do with the time. Vielle sat with this for a long time. A species that had spent 300,000 years on a Class 12 world, surrounded by things that could kill them, with bones that healed denser and adrenaline that muted pain, and the philosophical concept of, remember, you will die as a guiding principle rather than a paralyzing one. A species that looked at its own mortality and chose to find it useful. On Sethka, Vielle said slowly, there is no equivalent phrase. We do not... She searched. We do not regard death as a philosophical clarifier. We regard it as a failure of preparation. Ferreira looked up at her. The expression she wore was not one Vielle had catalogued before. Something attentive and not unkind, turned toward Vielle with the particular quality of someone who has just heard something that tells them more about a thing than the speaker intended. Yeah, Ferreira said. That tracks. She went back to the diagnostic. Vielle's frills went gold again at the edges, and she was already looking at the hull seam before she registered that she had turned away. The third weld point was still imprecise. She counted it again anyway. The cargo hold was approximately 12 meters at its longest axis. Vielle had measured this on the second day and remeasured it on the third because she had needed something to do with her body that was not lying in the harness waiting. And the harness was off now. Ferreira had removed it during the first examination, with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to all decisions she had apparently already made. She had not asked if Vielle wanted it removed. She had looked at the injury pattern, looked at the harness, determined that these two things should not continue to occupy the same space, and had dealt with the situation accordingly. Vielle had spent 4 cycles in some form of restraint. She kept expecting to feel it against her flanks. She kept pacing instead. On the 4th night, Ferreira maintained ship-standard cycles that Vielle had begun tracking without meaning to, regulating her own activity to the pattern of the human's waking hours and lying in the dark when those hours ended. Ferreira lay down on her salvage pack on the cargo hold floor and went to sleep, with her eyes closed. Vielle sat with this. She had confirmed in the species profile data that humans required cyclical unconsciousness. This was not unusual. Most species required reduced awareness recovery states. What varied was the degree of sensory maintenance during those states. The Sethka slept with their electromagnetic sense on passive detection, frills extended, the body keeping minimum viable threat awareness even during deepest rest. Every other species Vielle had encountered had an equivalent adaptation. Some kept visual or auditory pathways partially active, and some slept in configurations that kept their most mobile limbs free for rapid response. Ferreira was sleeping with her eyes completely closed and her arms in a configuration that would require measurable time to rearrange into a defensive posture. Her electromagnetic field was tidal. Entirely, completely tidal. No high-frequency threat processing, no low-level stress harmonics. The field of something that was resting with total conviction. Vielle extended her passive detection range to its maximum. Swept the hold, the corridor outside, the maintenance passage above. Nothing. No other biological signatures. She looked at the sleeping human. The field it was producing was the field of something that had, at some point in its evolutionary history, made a decision about whether it was prey. I made the decision and resolved it, and stopped maintaining it as an open case. The human's sleeping nervous system was not running escape calculations. It was not tracking the nearest exit. It had decided, at some foundational level, that Sethka fear neurochemistry would classify as pathological overconfidence, that it was not something prey. Not because it was wrong, because the decision had been made and was no longer under review. Vielle pulled her frills tight against her collarbone. Then she let them extend again, because the motion of pulling them tight was the posture she had worn for 4 cycles, and she was beginning to suspect she had performed it many times, when nothing that was actively threatening her had been present, simply because she had forgotten there was another option. She thought about her colony. She did not generally think about her colony because it produced a field spike severe enough to destabilize her electromagnetic perception for several minutes, the equivalent, she imagined, of a human trying to look directly at a bright light. But she was sitting in a cargo hold at night, watching a human sleep with its eyes closed, and something in her was doing the thinking whether she directed it to or not. The assessment had been conducted on a standard cycle, mid-morning, in the colony's administrative facility. Her family had been present. It had been, by all measurable criteria, a reasonable proceeding. The assessors had been professional. The language they had used had been precise and non-hostile. The word threlvas was the correct word for the situation. The clean logic of release. The rational surrender of a resource that cost more than it returned. And every being in the room had nodded when it was used, because it was correct, and they were rational beings who understood correct words. She looked at Ferreira. Ferreira had read the manifest. The manifest said Lot 7-4, Grade 2 Organic, 1,100 kilograms. The manifest was the Zovari expression of the same logic her colony's assessors had applied. The same conclusion, the same rational process. Ferreira had made a face she couldn't categorize, had set down her satchel, had started working, had stayed for 4 days now without any indication that she was applying the calculation at all. Vielle thought about the density scanner readout, about the healed fractures at 5 sites, about the upgraded bone that grew stronger at the break. Soldier, she thought about a species that had evolved on a Class 12 world for 300,000 years, that had been a persistence predator, that ate neurotoxins recreationally, that slept with its eyes closed. She thought about the face Ferreira had made when she read the manifest. She had cataloged it as unclassifiable on day 1, and had been returning to it at intervals since, running it against every expression taxonomy she possessed, and finding the same result each time. No match. She was beginning to suspect that the unclassifiable expression had been something in the neighborhood of wrong. Not her, not Vielle. The manifest. The manifest had been wrong, and Ferreira had read it and known it was wrong, and had set down her satchel. Vielle was producing gold at the tips of her frills. She couldn't stop it. She looked down at the cargo hold floor and counted the weld seams and breathed the recycled iron mineral air and listened to the tidal field of the sleeping human. And when her own body made the decision about which direction to face while she rested, she did not correct it. She was facing Ferreira. She let it be. On the 6th day, the cartel enforcement signature appeared on long-range sensors. Vielle felt it before the instruments confirmed it. Zovari enforcement vessels ran a distinct electromagnetic signature. High-density power draws, concentrated at the weapons systems, the resonant harmonic of suppression fields at standby readiness. And her body had learned to recognize this pattern, the way a deep current organism learns to recognize the pressure differential that moves ahead of something large and dangerous. "They're here," she said. Ferreira was already at the navigation console. Saw them about an hour ago, she said. Vielle crossed the cargo hold. 3 strides. She was aware, with some portion of attention, that she had not moved toward another being with this degree of intention in 4 years. Her body was making decisions she was monitoring with interest. She stopped at the navigation station. The contact overlays showed 6 signatures in high-value recovery formation. 6 ships, she said. Yep. That is not standard seizure enforcement deployment. Vielle's scales were cycling between crimson and silver, her emotional regulation behind schedule. 6 ships is priority recovery configuration, and they use it when the cargo is high value or when the seizure involved unauthorized boarding. Both apply here. Ferreira pulled up a schematic on the secondary display, the freighter's drive manifold. I've been pulling the governor housing. Vielle looked at the schematic. The governor was the component that kept every Zovari-registered vessel within cartel-authorized logistics corridors. Every ship in the network ran one. It was not technically removable by non-cartel personnel. It was removable by someone who had spent 6 days in a cargo hold with a precision tool and a considered opinion about what needed doing. If the governor is removed, Vielle said, the drive can sustain output above cartel-rated parameters. About 130% of rated tolerance should be enough. Vielle stood at the console. The crimson was still deep in her scales. Gold was happening at the frills again, and she could not regulate it. She was processing the timeline. Ferreira had boarded on day 1, had assessed the injuries, had begun removing the governor on day 2, before the enforcement fleet appeared on long-range sensors. Before. Which meant the removal had been planned before the enforcement fleet. Which meant Ferreira had boarded this ship, already planning to leave with it. And she had been here for 6 days, and you planned to take the ship from day 1, Vielle said. Modified it enough by day 1 to know it was viable, yeah. Why did you wait 6 days? Ferreira turned from the console and looked at her directly. The dark eyes, the ones that had seen too much. She held the look. Still had work to do, she said. Vielle's crimson deepened. The gold was doing what it wanted, and she stopped trying to regulate it. I don't understand, she said. The words came out too fast and slightly wrong at the edges, the way they had on day 1 when she'd realized she had forgotten how to speak. You sutured the injuries on day 1. You are a salvage operator. The ship is the salvage. You could have left at any point in the last 6 days. You stayed in a cargo hold with... She stopped. The word was waiting. It had always been waiting. With cargo. The word tasted like something that had been in storage too long. Ferreira looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the enforcement overlay. 14 hours to hailing range, she said. I need the governor fully out in 10. Get some rest if you can. She turned back to the console. Vielle stood in the middle of the cargo hold and heard the drive humming its slightly wrong harmonic, and the recycled air cycling through the filtration system, and below all of that, the tidal pulse of the human's electromagnetic field, steady and unhurried, as something that had made all its decisions before walking into the room. She went to her corner. She lay down. She listened to Ferreira work and did not rest, and did not understand, and stayed. The transit from Enforcement Intercept Range to the Vardis Belt Way Station was 11 hours and 40 minutes once the governor came out. The freighter was not rated for extended unsupported operation at full modified output. The drive manifold was running at approximately 128% of design tolerance, the coupling junctions producing thermal stress at levels that Vielle's engineering assessment classified as outside documented safety margins. The life support recyclers were functioning at a level she would call optimistic on a generous day. Ferreira appeared to find none of this worth significant comment. She ate. She ran 2 short sleep cycles. She made small drive adjustments twice, executed with the focused precision of someone conducting surgery on a living patient and expecting it to remain alive. Then she sat on the cargo hold floor with her back against the aft bulkhead and her salvage pack in her lap, and did not seem to require anything from her environment. Vielle sat across from her. She had been doing this, sitting across from Ferreira, for several days now, and she had not consciously initiated any of the occasions. She had simply looked up and found herself there, closer than before. Her body was making navigational decisions without consulting her. On the 4th hour of transit, Ferreira produced a small tool from her pack and began repairing the left glove. The glove was already repaired. Vielle had catalogued the repair history across their days together. 4 previous repairs, each in slightly different material, the oldest almost fully integrated into the surrounding fabric. The glove was older than several of the scars on Ferreira's hands. It had been maintained repeatedly because it was useful, and because the human had decided it was worth maintaining across years and multiple supply situations, and at least one incident that had involved something corrosive. Given the discoloration along the palm, Vielle watched the needle. "That glove has been repaired 5 times now," she said. "Yep. You have had it a long time. Long enough. Small stitches, even tension. The kind of precise, repetitive work that suggested it did not require full attention." Ferreira's hands moved, and her electromagnetic field remained tidal. And the drive hummed its overstressed harmonic, and the transit space folded around them. "My colony used Threlvas," Vielle said. She had not planned to say it. She had been thinking it for several days, circling it the way she had circled the hold dimensions on day 2, measuring something she hadn't been ready to look at directly. Ferreira tied off a stitch and looked up. "What's that?" she said. "It is..." Vielle searched her translation framework. The word did not carry across languages cleanly because most languages had not found it necessary to develop the concept at this level of precision. The rational release. The correct surrender of a thing when maintaining it costs more than it provides. Every rational species has a word for it, or an equivalent concept. For Sethka, it is Threlvas. She paused. It is considered the appropriate response. Correct. Emotionally neutral. A conclusion reached from correct data by correct reasoning. Ferreira looked at the glove. "Every species has a word for it," she repeated. "Yes." Ferreira turned the glove over. "Put it on. Flex the fingers." "The thing about salvage work," she said without looking at Vielle, "is that you spend a lot of time learning the difference between a thing that's actually cost more than it's worth, and a thing that someone decided wasn't worth the cost without finishing the math." Vielle was still. "The math on hasn't been done right," Ferreira said. "Yet." She put the repair kit away. She pulled out a foil packet. The capsaicin smell hit Vielle's chemoreceptors, and both frills deployed, and she let them. And she sat in the neurotoxic cloud without moving, and watched the human eat and did not move away. She thought about watching for the electromagnetic field when she woke up, about noting the distance when Ferreira moved to the far end of the hold, noting it the way her passive sensors noted any significant data point, not neutrally. With attention. She sat with this. Sat with it the way Ferreira sat with the drive at 128%, not fighting it, not ignoring it, present with it, doing the work, watching the instruments. On the 8th hour, Ferreira set aside the foil packet and pulled out another small object from her salvage pack. Approximately 12 centimeters in length, dark material, a pressure mechanism on one end. She engaged the mechanism with her thumb. A small contained flame appeared at the other end. Ferreira looked at it for a moment. Then she extinguished it with a breath and put it away. "What was that?" Vial said. "Lighter? Its function? Produces flame. I carry one as a habit." Ferreira looked at her pack with the expression Vial had learned to read as mild, private humor. "Never know when you need fire. On a ship. Especially on a ship." Vial filed this. She thought about fire. About a Class 12 world with atmospheric oxygen levels sufficient for significant combustion events. About a species that had evolved alongside fire long enough to learn to carry it as a personal habit. In a survival environment where "never know when you need fire" was a sentence that had, historically, been correct. "You keep it because the reflex persists," she said. "From the death world." Ferreira looked at her. The quality of the look was not surprise exactly. More the particular expression of a human who has been understood accurately and is registering the fact. "Yeah," she said. "Something like that." Vial thought about persistence predators, about the impulse that surfaces when we get invested in something, about a species that had spent 300,000 years in a Class 12 environment continuously attempting to be killed and had survived by chasing things, carrying fire, but apparently deciding, at some foundational level, that left marks on the behavior of its descendants across millennia. That the things it had chosen to carry and pursue were worth the cost. And then not revisiting that decision. She thought about the governor housing planned for removal on day 1. On the 10th hour, Ferreira lay down and closed her eyes. Vial faced her. She kept watch until the way station appeared on sensors. She was still watching when Ferreira woke, and when Ferreira looked across the hold at her, she did not look away. She thought about Threlvas, about the clean logic of release, about the word every rational species had. She thought about the glove with 5 repairs, about a flame carried on a ship for no tactical reason that the ship required, down only because the reflex persisted and Ferreira had decided that was fine. She did not have a word for the thing she was experiencing. Her language had never needed to reach this far. But she was, for the first time in 4 years, beginning to suspect that the absence of a word was not the same as the absence of a thing. It was not the same thing at all. The Vardis Belt Way Station's docking authority had 17 specific questions about an unlicensed salvage operator arriving in a Sovari-registered freighter with no clearance codes and a drive manifold producing EM emissions inconsistent with registered specifications. Ferreira answered all 17 questions. Vial listened from the cargo hold, reading the field, still title, on throughout the entire 11-minute exchange, and thought about what it meant that she could identify title as the right word for it now. That she had been reading this field long enough to know its character. They docked. 2 hours later, the enforcement fleet's electromagnetic signature appeared at the edge of her passive range. 6 ships. The same 6. They had not spent the transit period reconsidering. She felt the suppression fields coming to operational readiness before the instruments confirmed them. Felt the weapons lock preparations, felt the communications array powering up for wideband transmission, felt the pattern of a high-value recovery configuration that had found its mark and was running the final stages of authorized seizure proceedings. She had felt this before, in other cargo holds, on other ships, and each time she had been Lot 7-something, Grade 2 organic, a number waiting to be resolved. Ferreira came back into the cargo hold. "They found us faster than I wanted," she said. "Yes." Vial was already standing, deep crimson in her scales. "The way station will comply with cartel enforcement." They comply because cartel enforcement has the legal authority to compel compliance and the operational capacity to enforce it. They will reclassify you as a cartel accessory. They will board the ship. They will consult the manifest. "I'm filing a claim," Ferreira said. She had a datapad. She was typing. Vial went still. A claim. Under Interstellar Salvage Accord 7, a registered claim filed by a licensed salvage operator superseded active seizure proceedings in transit. But the filing window was narrow, and the value threshold was specific, and the Xovari would contest it, and "You are a licensed salvage operator," Vial said. "Yep." "Under ISA 7. "Yep." "You boarded an active seizure site, which constitutes open claim territory under Article 7, Section 2. "Yeah, I know my accords." Ferreira's thumbs were moving across the pad with the same precise focus she brought to sutures and drive repairs and glove seams. Vial stood in the middle of the hold. Her frills were cycling gold and crimson and silver in the fast, uncontrolled pattern that meant her emotional regulation was behind schedule. And her field was producing a high-frequency signature that would, she was distantly aware, be triggering involuntary alarm responses in any smaller organism within range. "My manifest value," she said, "filing at manifest value to trigger the supersession clause. I'm contesting the assessment, but the initial filing needs to meet threshold to execute the hold. The cartel will contest the entire proceeding. They can. They have 30 cycles to contest. In those 30 cycles, they will attempt to reclaim the asset. In those 30 cycles," Ferreira said, "your crew, and nobody gets to touch you." The enforcement frequency opened. The Xovari commander's voice came through the docking channel, crisp and official, and carrying the weight of authority that had not, in recent memory, been asked to justify itself. "Unregistered salvage vessel. You are in possession of Xovari registered organic property under active seizure proceedings. Surrender the cargo and stand by for crew detainment and processing." Ferreira pressed transmit. "This is licensed salvage operator Mara Ferreira, ISA 7 claim filed and timestamped. Lot 7-4. Claim supersedes active seizure under ISA Article 12, Section 3. Filing is on record with Vardis Belt Registry. My crew and I will remain aboard pending the standard contest window." She put the transmit down. Silence on the enforcement channel. "My crew. Not cargo, not claim, not Lot 7-4, Grade 2 organic 1,100 kilograms estimated yield. Crew." The word sat in the recycled iron mineral air of the cargo hold. Vial was looking at the hull seam above the access hatch, the one with 12 weld points and the third one slightly imprecise. She counted them again. She studied the imprecision of the third weld point with the focused attention of someone who was not looking at the human, because looking at the human directly was not something she was capable of right now. 12 seams. Third one imprecise. Ferreira's field was tidal. Vial's frills were gold, completely, totally, unregulably gold. The enforcement channel crackled. Ferreira waited. They came anyway. This was the thing about enforcement fleets. They were not structured to process the word no. They were structured to produce no at significant volume and rely on the operating assumption that no traveled in one direction only. The suppression pulse hit the freighter's hull, and the emergency lighting went red, and Vial felt the pulse's electromagnetic component as a broad frequency wash that temporarily saturated her passive sensors. She had already oriented toward the pilot station. Ferreira was already there. She had been there before the pulse hit, which was a thing Vial was adding to the long file she had been building of human behavior that she had initially classified as tactical irrationality and had subsequently, case by case, reclassified as preparation that had not announced itself. "Brace," Ferreira said. Vielle looked at the cargo harness, the 2-ton rated restraint that had left lacerations along her flank over 16 days. She looked at it for one moment. Then she moved to the forward bulkhead, pressed her palms flat against the hull, and planted her legs at the stance width her gravity-well-adapted musculature was built for. 3.4 tons of bone density and muscle development from a 0.9 environment, braced against a freighter hull. The second suppression pulse hit. She absorbed it. On the view screen, 6 Sovari reinforcement vessels were holding the high-value recovery formation. Box configuration with a forward spear point, command vessel at the apex. Vielle knew this formation. She knew what it assumed. The target would attempt to flee along the open axis. The formation was designed to collapse that axis. Standard doctrine for when the target lacked the drive capacity to significantly outrun enforcement ships. The drive came on. The modified drive, governor removed, running at full output, 128% of rated tolerance. The coupling junctions doing things that were not within documented safety margins, every seam on the hull producing the harmonic of a structure operating past its comfortable parameters. Ferreira flew it directly at the spear point. For one crystalline, absolutely lucid moment, Vielle had no frame of reference for this. Then she understood. The command vessel was the apex. Box formation required the apex to hold position until flanking ships confirmed intercept lock. Breaking the apex broke the doctrine, and doctrine was the structure inside which they operated, and the structure assumed no target would fly toward a military interdiction point in a modified cargo freighter because that was irrational, and irrational behavior was not a variable the doctrine had been designed to accommodate. They would not break formation, and they did not break formation. The gap opened, not much, not for long, enough. And Ferreira took it, and the enforcement fleet reconfigured, and the drive pushed the freighter through at 128% output, and everything on the ship was doing something, and none of it was receiving attention because the jump point was 12 seconds out. 8. The command ship's weapons array came to full operational readiness. Vielle felt the targeting lock, the precise, sharp harmonic of a system that had found its mark and was awaiting authorization. The mark was this ship. The mark was the manifest. The mark was Lot 7-4. She was standing against the forward bulkhead, with her palms flat on the hull and her scales blazing gold, even through the crimson threat response, and she did not move. Ferreira did not move. 5, 2, 1. The stars smeared. The drive reached its limit and crossed it, and the freighter punched into hyperspace transit, and the targeting lock vanished. And there was nothing outside the view screen except the non-light of transit space. That particular lightless quality that had no color in any language Vielle knew. The drive went quiet. Ferreira's hands were still on the controls. Her electromagnetic field was tidal. Vielle stood against the forward bulkhead with her palms still flat on the hull, and the gold blazing from her frills strong enough to light the cargo hold. And she did not move for a long time. She was aware that during the intercept run, she had not been calculating her own survival probability. She had been calculating the position of the targeting lock relative to the pilot station. She filed this in the new data category and examined it actually, because the thing about this particular data point was that it was too significant to defer. She had been, for 4 years, a thing that existed in cargo holds, a classified organism, a number on a manifest. The question of her survival had been, for 4 years, outside her operational purview. Not something she was asked to weigh in on. not something that had been structured as her decision to make. Survival was a logistics question the cartel answered by assigning her a grade. Her role was to be the material that the logistics question was about. She had spent the entire intercept run monitoring the weapons lock relative to the pilot station. She had done this without deciding to. Her passive sensors had tracked the lock's harmonic frequency, noted when it adjusted, the incremental micro-corrections that targeting systems made as their mark moved. And her body had calculated the vector, assessed the likelihood of fire authorization, and oriented itself toward the possibility of interception. Not her survival. The pilot station. She filed this, very carefully, in the new data category, alongside all the other entries she had been building. The watching for the electromagnetic field when she woke. The noting of distance when Ferreira moved away. The direction she faced when she slept. The file was large now. Post-jump checks, Ferreira said from the controls. Drive thermals are elevated. Coupling 3 is going to need attention before we do anything else. I can assist, Vial said. I have direct EM sensor access to the coupling junction temperature gradient. I can give you real-time readings. Ferreira looked up. That would help, she said. Yes. Vial moved to the auxiliary panel beside the pilot station. It was not designed for a 3.7-meter Sethka, but she oriented herself so that her frills were at the correct distance from the panel's EM sensor port, and extended her active detection range to interface with the ship's field, and read the coupling temperatures with the same precision she had been reading Ferreira's electromagnetic signature for 11 days. Coupling 3 is at 114% of rated thermal tolerance, declining at approximately 2% per minute. Coupling 7 is at 108. Couplings 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, 8 are all within documented safety margins. Ferreira had a datapad open. She was entering the readings. Give me updates every 5 minutes until 3 is below 100, she said. Yes. They worked. The drive cooled. Vial read the temperatures, and Ferreira tracked the decline curve and the transit space folded around them in its colorless non-light, and neither of them spoke except in the specific technical language of coupling thermals and EM field gradients. It was, Vial thought, the most useful she had been in 4 years. She filed this too. The 3 days of repairs at Pella Station were the first 3 days in 4 years that Vial had spent doing something. Not being assessed, not being transported, not waiting in a hold for the next transfer, the next manifest, the next intake officer with a scanner and a data clip. Doing something. Ferreira had been specific about what coupling 3 needed, and Vial had provided continuous EM temperature readings, while Ferreira worked the junction with a tool that had also been repaired more than once. And at some point, on the first day, Ferreira had looked at the mounting bracket above the coupling and said, if I could get a reading on the secondary conductor field without pulling the housing. And Vial had extended her active detection range to the secondary conductor and read her the field gradient. Ferreira had looked at her for a moment. That's useful, she said. Yes, Vial said. I know. Ferreira had made the almost smile expression, the one Vial had catalogued on day 4 and had been slowly learning to read as the human's version of acknowledgement, and gone back to the junction. They worked for 3 days. The freighter's drive came back to rated tolerance. The coupling junctions normalized. The thermal alerts cleared, one by one, until the diagnostic panel showed a row of green indicators that Ferreira looked at with the same expression she used for things that had been made adequately correct. On the morning of the 3rd day, Ferreira filed the registry paperwork. Vial stood in the corridor outside the main diagnostic bay, while Ferreira went through the documents. She could read Ferreira's field through the bulkhead. Tidal, with the particular quality it had, when she was concentrating on a task that required care. No spikes, no hesitation signatures. She had watched Ferreira prepare the counter-assessment documentation on the second night, working at the navigation console with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Vielle had pretended to rest and had watched instead. The counter-assessment had taken 2 hours. Ferreira had cross-referenced intake records against ISA 7 provision language, built the legal argument with the same methodical precision she applied to drive manifold schematics, and then had reviewed the entire document 3 times before saving it. The word crew appeared in the filing. Vielle had seen it on the second review pass. She had not said anything, like she had faced the other direction and waited for her frills to stop doing what they were doing. And they had not stopped. And she had given up regulating them and lay in the gold dark and listened to Ferreira type. Now she stood in the corridor and waited. The field through the bulkhead was still tidal. Vielle thought about 4 years, about the specific character of 4 years of cargo hold electromagnetic fields, the flat, efficient emissions of Zovari processing staff, the anxious, high-frequency signatures of other organic cargo. That's the occasional distant harmonics of vessels and stations passing through her passive range. A 4-year catalog of fields, none of which had been tidal. Ferreira came out of the documentation bay with the datapad. "Ready?" she said. "Yes," Vielle said. They went to the registry office. Now, the Pellas Station registry office had 1 human standard chair, which Ferreira used, and 1 desk, which the Pellas registrar used, and no provision for a 3.7-meter Sethka. Vielle stood behind Ferreira. She had not specifically decided to stand behind Ferreira. She had walked into the registry office and found herself there. And she had stopped questioning the navigational decisions her body made because they had, consistently, turned out to be correct. The registrar was a cheth, tri-limbed, approximately 1 meter at standing height, a species that had been processing station registry filings since before the current Zovari cartel existed in its present form, and had achieved a quality of administrative equanimity about unusual situations. Vielle's presence registered briefly and was filed. The Zovari manifest claim received more attention. The ISA 7 claim was filed correctly and within the requisite window. The registrar said, with the tone of someone delivering a verdict made inevitable by correct procedure, "The Zovari contest will proceed through standard arbitration, approximately 30 standard days. During the contest period—" "I want to amend the filing," Ferreira said. The registrar paused. "Amend. Filed at manifest value to trigger supersession. I'm contesting the assessment now." She placed the datapad on the desk. "Counter-assessment is documented here." The registrar looked at the datapad. Vielle could not see the screen. She knew what was on it, because she and Ferreira had spent 2 hours of the final transit leg going through her documentation. 4 years of Zovari intake records, transport logs, processing assessments, each assigning her a grade and a weight and an estimated yield value. The records were thorough. The Zovari were thorough. She had been very thoroughly documented as a number. "The counter-assessment," the registrar said, with the specific tone of a bureaucratic organism encountering something for which its current workflow had no prepared response category, "classifies the subject as crew," Ferreira said. "Skilled labor, 1st grade. Sethka electromagnetic sensor specialist with operational experience in Zovari logistics environments." The registrar looked at Vielle. Vielle's frills were fully extended. Gold bioluminescence was illuminating a small area of the registry office, and she was not doing anything to stop it. "The Zovari will contest the reclassification." the registrar said. ISA-7, on Article 19, Ferreira said. Forced labor reclassification provision requires documented evidence of involuntary service and a filed testimony from the subject. I've got 4 years of intake records, and she's here to testify. The registrar's primary visual organs moved to Vial. Vial thought about Threlvas, about the clean logic of release, the rational surrender of a thing that costs more than it provides. The word her colony had used, precisely and without cruelty, on a standard mid-morning cycle, with her family present. About the assessors who had been professional, and the intake officer who had been thorough, and the Zovari processing system that had assigned her a grade. About a human dropping through an access hatch on day 1 and reading her manifest and making a face she couldn't categorize. I can provide complete testimony, she said. Her voice was steady. She had not expected it to be steady. Intake documentation, transport logs, transfer records, and processing disposition records for the full 4-cycle period. Dates, vessel identifications, assessor designations, and grade assessments at each processing stage. She paused. I have total electromagnetic field recall of the complete period, which constitutes continuous experiential documentation. The registrar entered something. Name, it said. Vial paused. Her Sethka designation was a sound pattern assigned at hatch emergence, encoding her bloodline and clutch position and the electromagnetic signature of the breeding current she had come from. It was attached to everything she had been, to every assessment, to every lot number. She had not done anything wrong by existing. Vial, she said. Vial of the Sethka Eastern Current, electromagnetic sensor specialist, 1st grade. The registrar entered it. Ferreira signed the form. The signature appeared on the display. Ferreira, M., licensed salvage operator, ISA Registry 7-4472. Counter-assessment of former Lot 7-4, Zovari Processing Manifest, reclassified as Crew, 1st grade, Ferreira Salvage Operation. Vial looked at the signature. She looked at the glove on Ferreira's right hand, the one with 5 repairs. The oldest repair almost fully integrated. The newest in slightly different thread, careful even tension, the same focused attention the human brought to sutures and drive calibrations, and the quiet work of maintaining things it had decided were worth the cost. She looked at the glove for a long time. You could have left, she said. Ferreira looked up. At any point? The words were coming more easily now. The vocal apparatus had been in daily use long enough that the roughness had worn off. The seizure site, the drive modification, the enforcement intercept, any of it. The rational assessment of cost versus return. You were always crew, Ferreira said. 3 words. Vial stood in the registry office of Pella Station and heard them land. She thought about Threlvas, about the word every rational species had for the clean logic of release, about the assumption she had carried for 4 years, longer, really, from the first assessment, from the first lot number, or from before she had learned to hold herself quiet. That a thing of her dimensions and her cost had a trajectory that logic dictated, and that the logic was correct because it was the same logic every rational being applied. She thought about a human who had never, at any point, run the calculation the way her colony had run it. She thought about what that meant. The registrar printed the form. Ferreira folded it and put it in the repaired glove's pocket. She stood up, walked to the door, paused with one hand on the frame. Vial watched her from across the registry office. 3.7 meters of Sethka, gold bioluminescence making a small second sun in a room designed for bureaucratic neutrality. Ferreira looked back at her. Her electromagnetic field was tidal. It had been tidal on day 1 when she read the manifest, and it had been tidal on the nights she slept on the cargo hold floor. It had been tidal during the suppression pulses and the enforcement intercept and the jump sequence at the edge of weapons lock. It had never not been tidal. Vial had been a Sethka electromagnetic sensor for her entire life. She had spent 4 years as the most sensitive detection instrument in every cargo hold the Zovari had put her in, reading the fields of every organism that came near her. The jagged fear of handlers who found her size unsettling, the flat efficiency of assessors, the complicated anxious fields of other cargo. She had read fields for most of her conscious life. She had never, before Ferreira, read a field that was tidal at weapons lock. "Freighter's not going to fix itself," Ferreira said. She went out. Vial stood in the registry office for one more moment. Then she walked out after her. The station was loud in the way stations were loud. Layered harmonic signatures of 100 vessels, overlapping electromagnetic fields of a dozen species. Recycled air carrying trace minerals, an engine exhaust, and something being cooked in a food stall 30 meters down the corridor that hit Vial's chemoreceptors as sharp and aggressive and not dangerous. Ferreira walked beside her. 3.7 meters. Ferreira came to her shoulder. The scale of it had been 4 years ago and most of her life before that. A defect on assessments, a number in the unfavorable column. She was not going to think about it that way. She had decided this somewhere in the 11-hour transit, and the decision was made and filed, and no longer under active review. Done somewhere in the bureaucratic architecture of ISA filing systems, Lot 7-4, Grade 2 organic, 1,100 kilograms estimated yield was being replaced by a name. Ferreira was humming. The same low rhythmic sound she made in the cargo hold when things had resolved into a state she found acceptable. Vial still had no cultural context for it, no taxonomic category that explained it. It served no tactical purpose. It was simply something the human produced when the current situation was, by her assessment, adequately fine. The thing about fine, Vial thought, was that it was not a number. It was not a grade or a cost-to-return ratio or a conclusion reached by applying correct logic to correct data. It was a conclusion reached by a different kind of math. She had been looking for a word. For 11 days, she had been reaching for a word in Sethka, in trade standard, in the Zovari administrative language she had spent 4 years absorbing. And she had not found one because it did not come from language. It came from this. From the station noise and the capsaicin smell and the tidal field of the human walking beside her and the registration form folded into the pocket of a 5 times repaired glove. From the fact that she was walking forward, that she was walking forward at all. Ferreira hummed. The sound traveled through 4 meters of station air and registered on Vial's passive EM sensors as biological warmth, small and steady and entirely without fear. The field of something that had never had a word for Threlvas, had never needed one. Vial extended her frills to their full span, let the gold light go where it wanted, walked. She kept walking. She did not look back.